Ray Dalio isn't just another billionaire making loud predictions for attention. He's the one investors listen to when the noise gets too loud and the world stops making sense. For 5 decades, he's been studying the rise and fall of empires, the booms that make people rich, and the crashes that wipe out everything they thought was secure. He built his entire career on understanding patterns that repeat across centuries, long before most people even noticed they've returned. And every time the world drifted toward danger, he was one of the few voices who could see the storm forming while everyone else was still celebrating the sunshine. In 2008, he warned his clients that the foundations of the global economy were cracking, and he positioned his fund long before the collapse became obvious. When the rest of Wall Street was drowning in losses, his strategy didn't just survive the chaos, it grew through it. Bridgewater didn't become the largest hedge fund on earth because of luck or hype. It earned that position because Dalio built a system that doesn't depend on guessing, emotions, or optimism. He built it on cold data, historical cycles, and cause and effect mechanics that behave the same way whether it's 1929, 2008, or right now. That's why when he speaks today, people lean in with a different kind of attention, the kind you give to someone who has been right in moments when being wrong meant disaster. And today, he's repeating something he said only a handful of times in his entire career. He's saying that everything happening around us, the debt, the politics, the global tensions, the cost of living, the breakdown of trust in institutions, isn't random chaos. It's the same set of forces that have shown up in every major turning point throughout history. He says we're entering a phase that looks eerily similar to the periods that reshaped nations, rewired financial systems, and transferred massive amounts of wealth from the unprepared to the prepared. He's calling it a historic storm, one that doesn't appear suddenly, but builds slowly, quietly, and relentlessly in the background, while most people are too busy to notice the pressure rising. And according to him, the signs aren't subtle anymore. They're everywhere, visible to anyone who understands how the economic machine behaves when it's pushed past its limits. He says this moment isn't about panic. It's about recognizing the mechanics before they fully unfold, the way a seasoned sailor can sense a hurricane long before the first drop of rain. Because once the storm hits, it won't reward the strongest or the smartest. It will reward the ones who prepared early, the ones who understood the rhythm of the cycle before the rest of the world caught up. The core of Dalio's warning comes from the way he studies the world, not as a collection of random events, but as a machine that repeats the same motions over and over again. He believes everything we're seeing today is part of a long-term debt cycle that starts quietly, grows slowly, and ends violently when the pressure finally snaps. He breaks that cycle into phases, and once you understand them, the chaos around us suddenly starts making sense. It begins with a period of easy money, when borrowing feels harmless, interest rates stay low, and governments, corporations, and households all convince themselves that debt is simply fuel for growth. For years, that illusion holds because the economy expands, asset prices rise, and people mistake the boom for stability instead of recognizing it as leverage stacked on leverage. But every cycle eventually reaches the point where the debt becomes too large and too fragile to support, and small cracks begin to appear long before the crisis becomes visible. Dalio says we've passed that threshold already, and the world is now moving through the late stages of the cycle, where confidence begins to erode, but the system keeps stretching anyway. The stress becomes worse when interest rates rise faster than anyone expected, suddenly turning yesterday's cheap obligations into today's crushing burdens. Governments start paying more on their debt than they spend on essential services. Corporations scramble to roll over loans they can no longer afford. And families who stretched to buy homes during the easy money years find themselves trapped. Dalio argues that this is exactly how the machine behaves when the cycle is approaching a breaking point. And history shows the same sequence every single time. He says, this kind of economic pressure doesn't stay contained. It spreads, triggering political polarization, social frustration, and distrust in institutions, as people look for someone to blame for problems that were years in the making. That tension grows even more dangerous when combined with a world where major powers are rivaling for dominance, each trying to protect their influence while the global order tilts off balance. According to him, we are now living in a moment shaped by 3 large forces converging at the same time: massive debt burdens, deep internal conflicts, and rising geopolitical risks between powerful nations. He says you only see these 3 forces align during the most significant historical turning points, the periods that rewritten economic rules and reshaped the balance of global power. And just like past cycles, he believes money will not behave normally during the next phase, which is why he's already begun repositioning his portfolio before the pressure fully erupts. He's buying assets that historically survive long debt cycles, political turmoil, and currency devaluations. the kind of assets that protect purchasing power when traditional markets start behaving unpredictably. Gold is one of his core positions, not because it's shiny or symbolic, but because for thousands of years it has outlived every currency debasement, every monetary reset, and every period of financial repression. He's also investing in countries that are positioned for long-term growth, economies that have room to expand while others are reaching their limits, especially emerging markets that benefit when global power shifts. And he's allocating into inflation-protected assets, the kind that rise when money loses value and governments attempt to inflate away their debts instead of confronting them directly. Dalio says these choices aren't guesses. They're responses to patterns that have unfolded repeatedly across history, from ancient empires to modern superpowers. And when you map those patterns onto today, the picture that emerges is one of a cycle nearing its next major chapter. Dalio's message isn't just a warning about what's coming. It's a blueprint for how to survive a moment that can quietly erase decades of progress if you're not positioned before the shift happens. He says that every major turning point in history creates two groups of people, those who cling to old assumptions and those who adapt early while the noise still sounds distant. And the difference between those two groups becomes visible only after the cycle flips, when asset prices move in ways that feel impossible to anyone who didn't understand the mechanics. That's why he focuses on balance, not bravado, because the next phase won't reward the all-in mindset or the gambler's mentality that worked during the years of cheap money. He says the smartest strategy in a fragile environment is diversification across time, across countries, and across types of assets that respond differently when stress hits the system. He believes the portfolios most at risk right now are the ones concentrated in a single country, a single market, or a single narrative that only works when everything is calm and predictable. Instead, he leans toward the kind of structure that can bend without breaking, a mix of inflation hedges, growth exposures, and safety positions that balance each other when volatility arrives. He argues that people should think in terms of resilience rather than returns, because in a late-stage cycle, the goal shifts from maximizing gains to protecting the ability to stay in the game. Dalio says cash won't be the safe haven many people assume, because governments under pressure tend to devalue their currencies in slow, subtle ways that most people don't notice until it's too late. He warns that bonds may struggle as well, because rising interest costs and unstable fiscal conditions can turn what used to be a risk-free asset into a risk transfer from governments to the public. He believes stocks will become far more unpredictable, not because companies suddenly stop creating value, but because markets behave differently when confidence evaporates and liquidity thins. And he says this uncertainty is exactly why spreading exposure across regions matters, because the next decade won't treat every country the same, and the winners of tomorrow may not be the giants of today. Dalio points to indicators he watches obsessively, signals that reveal when the machine is shifting gears, the steepening or flattening of the yield curve, the widening of credit spreads, the pace of currency declines, and the rise of political extremism as a pressure valve for economic stress. He says these signals don't predict the exact moment the storm breaks, but they show when the clouds are getting darker and the wind is beginning to change direction. And right now, he believes those indicators are flashing the same patterns he's seen in every major transition throughout history. He says preparation doesn't happen in the panic phase. When markets are already falling and emotions take over, it happens quietly, months or even years before, when conditions still feel livable and people convince themselves they have more time than they actually do. Dalio emphasizes that wealth doesn't disappear during a transition. It moves, shifting from vulnerable hands to stronger ones, from concentrated bets to diversified structures, from paper gains to real assets that hold value. He believes individuals who understand this dynamic can position themselves to avoid the worst pain of the cycle and potentially benefit from the opportunities that emerge on the other side. He warns that the timeline of these shifts is rarely obvious in the moment because cycles accelerate suddenly after long periods of slow, almost invisible buildup. That's why he acts early, not because he wants to be dramatic, but because he's seen too many people wait for certainty in a world that never gives it. He says the people who protect themselves are the ones who recognize that preparation is a quiet decision, made long before the world realizes how close it is to a turning point.